When I opened my eyes, the ceiling was white and too clean to belong to my century. The last ceiling I remembered had been patched with bamboo, blackened by smoke, and trembling from the distant thud of shells. That night, no. That other life, I had been a girl with ink-stained fingers and a radio headset pressed to my ear, counting coded bursts while the city around us tried to keep breathing. A flare had turned the alley into daylight. And then the world snapped, sharp as a wire. I had died with a name on my lips that no one in the evacuation tunnel heard, and yet here I was, alive, warm, and painfully confused. My skull pulsed as if someone had poured boiling water between my thoughts. I lifted a hand to my forehead and found a bandage, firm and modern, smelling faintly of antiseptic instead of ash. The hand was not my hand. The skin was smoother, the nails trimmed, the knuckles too delicate for the work I once did. My chest rose with a breath that belonged to someone younger than my memories but older than my fear. Voices drifted in from the corridor. One was a man's, steady and controlled. The other belonged to a boy, impatient and sharp. "She's faking," the boy insisted. "She fell on purpose. Everyone knows she's trying to frame Vi." The man replied quietly, "Enough. This is our family's matter." The boy snorted. "Family? I'm engaged to Vi. I don't care where that girl came from. The Lay family recognizes only Vi." A door clicked. Footsteps approached. Panic tried to climb my throat, but the strange body I occupied stayed calm, as if it had practiced swallowing humiliation for years. The door opened and two faces entered my vision. A handsome young man in a tailored coat and a teenage boy with restless eyes. The boy stared at me like a nuisance that refused to disappear. The man's expression softened, though his jaw tightened with worry. "Dao," he said, voice low. "You're awake." The name did not fit my old life, yet it landed in my mind like a key. Quinn Dao. That was who this body belonged to. Not the girl who once hid in a basement writing numbers on scrap paper, but a daughter of wealth, returned too late, surrounded by people who had already decided what she should feel. I tried to speak, and my throat rasped. The boy rolled his eyes. "Still acting?" The man ignored him and stepped closer. "I'm Trin Min Hui," he said. "Your brother." Brother. The word unlocked a flood. Images bright, glossy, unfamiliar poured into me. A baby swapped in a clinic, a poor countryside house, a school uniform patched too many times, a phone screen full of messages never answered, and then, abruptly, a black car at a gate bearing the Trin family crest. A DNA report, a reunion staged like a press release, and a girl named Mai V, cherished for 17 years, standing beside my new mother in a dress that cost more than the roof of my former home. The memories were not mine, but they clung to me like wet cloth. I understood enough to understand my position. An authentic daughter returned to a house that had already filled her space with someone else. I understood also that the fall down the stairs was not an accident. In the borrowed memory, Vi's hand had shoved. The push was small, a gesture masked as panic, but the intent was clear. The body remembered. The body wanted justice, yet the mind I carried from another era wanted something else entirely. I wanted to look at this peaceful world and confirm it was real. I wanted to know if the sirens were truly gone. Hui called for a doctor, and the doctor examined me with efficient kindness. "Concussion," he said, "and likely temporary amnesia. Let her rest." The boy, named Lakian by the memory, muttered something about wasted time and stormed out. Hui stayed. He sat beside my bed as if he had been trained to sit at the edge of problems, not inside them. "You'll remember," he promised, and his voice carried the weight of a family that preferred neat conclusions. He explained what I already knew from the flood. I had been found. After years in a distant village, the Trin family had accepted me. Vi was the adopted daughter whose late mother had been involved in the swap. "No one blames Vi," he said quickly, as if his loyalty needed to be announced. "She didn't know." Then he offered compensation the way businessmen offer discounts. "Father decided to transfer 5% of the company shares to you, to make things fair." Fair. The word tasted like chalk. In my first life, fairness meant surviving the night. Here, fairness was a percentage. I looked at Hui and asked, "Do you have 5%? He blinked. "That's different." "And Vi?" I continued, voice calm. "She has 3, right?" His eyes flickered. He mistook my steadiness for returning memory. He did not realize it was older than his entire world. "You remember," he murmured. I did not correct him. I asked for my phone, a sleek rectangle that glowed like a captured star. When Hoy left, I searched the internet with hands that trembled not from fear but from awe. War, history, reconstruction, satellites, vaccines, bridges spanning rivers that once separated desperate people. I scrolled until my eyes blurred. My country, our country, stood tall in this era, complicated and imperfect, but no longer on its knees. Tears slipped down my cheeks without permission. If this was a dream, it was the gentlest dream fate had ever given me. I pressed a palm to my heart and whispered the name I had died with. Trong Duke. The room did not answer. Only my phone screen did, reflecting a face that was not mine, framed by hospital light and a future I had never earned. They came that evening, as Hui predicted. The couple who were now my parents, dressed like they had stepped out of a magazine, followed by V in a shimmering gown because she had just performed at a piano competition. Their arrival filled the room with expensive perfume and unspoken expectations. My new mother, Mrs. Trin, smiled the way a hostess smiles at an inconvenient guest. "Dao," she said. "How do you feel?" I sat up carefully. "I'm fine," I answered, and the honesty surprised them. They had waited for tears, rage, jealousy, a performance of wounded entitlement. The body I lived in had wanted that once. The mind I brought from the past had no interest. "This incident," my new father said, eyes on the bandage, "we will let it go. But if you ever act recklessly again, don't blame us for being disappointed." I nodded, because in his language, disappointment was a leash. Vi stood behind them, chin lifted, her gaze glittering with a faint challenge she probably didn't recognize as cruelty. Hoi mentioned the shares again. My father spoke as if he were closing a deal. 5% is generous, he declared. Many would be grateful. I thought of the girl whose body I wore. She had lived a decade of poverty, had clawed her way back through police reports and DNA tests, and now her reward was being told to be grateful. I felt sorrow for her so sharply it almost became anger. Almost. Instead, I simply said, "Thank you." It was safer. It also bought me something priceless. Time. Time, in this era, was full of tools. I spent my discharge week in a small guest room of the Trin mansion, a place that was technically mine yet felt like a hotel sponsored by guilt. I learned to use a laptop. I learned the maps of the city. I learned what people meant by cloud storage. And I laughed once, quietly, because in my old life the only cloud we feared was the one that followed a bombing run. On the 8th day, I returned to school. The private academy was a world of polished floors and soft shoes, where students carried wealth in the way they carried backpacks. Carelessly, as if it weighed nothing. When I stepped into my classroom, the chatter paused, not because I was important, but because I was a story. The real daughter, the countryside girl, the troublemaker who had tried to hurt V. I took my seat and opened a notebook filled with someone else's messy handwriting. I would have to imitate it until people stopped staring at the difference. A boy with dyed red hair leaned over. "Heard you tried to push V," he said, grinning like cruelty was a sport. "But you fell instead. Pathetic." His name, the memory supplied, was Pham Bao, a rich child with a temper and too much confidence. I looked at his hair, impossibly bright, and wondered how society could afford such wasted energy. I smiled. "Yes," I said, voice light. I couldn't win an argument, so I threw myself down the stairs to frame her. The class went silent again, not expecting agreement. Bao blinked, confused. "You're insane," he muttered. "I'm practical," I corrected. "Anything else?" Bao's anger flared, but a teacher entered, cutting the moment like a blade. The first month was a slow lesson in modern cruelty. No one beat me with fists. They did not need to. They dropped their voices when I approached. They hid my textbooks. They placed insects in my desk drawer. They laughed in small, synchronized bursts, like a machine designed to remind me of my place. I watched them with the patience of someone who had once lived among soldiers and refugees. Children like this thought humiliation was the worst wound. They had never seen hunger. They had never seen a mother carry a child wrapped in a raincoat because there was no coffin. I did not despise them. I simply refused to fear them. When Bao's group placed caterpillars on my desk, I gathered them gently into a cup and released them outside the window. The girls squealed anyway, as if kindness itself was disgusting. One noon, Bao slept with his face on his arms, snoring softly. The class was quiet. A faint rustle came from the door. A small black snake slid into the room, thin as a ribbon, moving with slow certainty. It passed under desks and disappeared into Bao's drawer. When Bao woke and reached for his pen, the snake lifted its head. The scream that followed tore through the classroom. Chairs scraped back. Girls climbed onto desks. Boys shouted. I stayed seated, my hands folded, watching the chaos like a scene from a badly directed play. Bao saw me sitting still and pointed a shaking finger. It's her, he yelled at the teacher when she arrived. She did it! She's too calm. Let's check the cameras, I suggested, because modern tools were my favorite kind of justice. The school pulled footage. The snake had entered alone, but the cameras also captured Bao's group, the day before, placing insects in my drawer while laughing. Their faces drained of color as the principal watched. Bao's mother was summoned. She did not shout. She did something far worse. She stared at her son with the cool disappointment of a powerful woman who disliked messy failures. Bao tried to speak. His voice died. That night he went home with a fever caused by fear and shame. The school sprayed the building for pests, and for a while, the hallway silence around me became less sharp. In my dorm room, I studied until my eyes ached. I studied because knowledge was the cleanest kind of freedom. I studied because this era had oceans of information, and I had spent a lifetime thirsting. I opened history books and found my old world reduced to chapters, dates, and photos that could not carry smell or sound. I recognized battles and names, and I also saw what came after. Treaties, reforms, neon cities, a generation that laughed without flinching at thunder. I cried again, not from grief but from gratitude so intense it felt like pain. This, I whispered into the quiet dorm, is the best time. At the Trin house, my decision not to fight V confused them more than any tantrum would have. They had expected me to claw for attention like a starving animal. Instead, I asked for one thing: permission to live in the school dormitory full-time. Why? My father demanded. We can hire tutors. We can give you anything. Anything, in his vocabulary, meant money and control. I need time, I said, and I need quiet. Vi's eyes brightened with relief she tried to hide. She wanted me gone. Hui argued against my request at first. Then, to my surprise, he supported it. Perhaps he was tired of being the mediator in a house that called itself a family. The paperwork was signed. I moved into a single dorm room, a privilege disguised as practicality. With distance came oxygen. My grades rose quickly, not because the classes were easy, but because I treated them like a mission. In my first life, I had learned to study by candlelight, to memorize codes under stress, to focus while bombs shook the street. A physics problem could not frighten me. Still, when I looked at the subject choices for senior year, I hesitated. The body's old preferences leaned toward literature and social sciences. The memory of my old self leaned toward history. But something deeper in me remembered the reason we had suffered. Weakness, ignorance, dependence. In my era, we had sent the brightest abroad because we lacked teachers at home. I had watched brilliant minds drowned by circumstance. Now, with this second life, I wanted to help build the kind of strength that would make invasion unthinkable. I applied to switch to the science track. Physics, chemistry, biology. My homeroom teacher frowned. Girls struggle, she warned gently, repeating a prejudice disguised as concern. I smiled and said, then I will struggle loudly. The news reached my family, as news always did in wealthy houses where privacy was an illusion. My father summoned me for dinner. He spoke with the authority of someone who believed blood was obedience. Vi's track is social sciences, he said. That suits you too. Later you can study law or finance. That's useful. Useful to him, I translated. Useful to the company. Useful to the alliances he wanted to build. I've chosen, I said. My choice doesn't change. His face tightened. If your scores drop, you will be responsible. I met his gaze calmly. I am already responsible. He hated that I did not bend. He hated perhaps that I did not need him. Soon after, he tested me in the only language he valued: control of resources. He cut off my allowance and instructed everyone in the household not to spoil me with help. He assumed I would return, desperate, begging to be allowed back into his favor. He forgot or never understood that the girl I used to be had survived on less than pride. In my first life, we counted grains of rice. In this life, I could earn. I became a tutor. The idea was almost funny. Me, the unwanted daughter, paid to improve the children of other wealthy families. I found my first client through a class monitor who liked me for reasons she couldn't explain. "They pay a lot," she whispered. "The kid is hopeless, but the mother is intense." I followed the address to a gated villa larger than the Trin mansion. When a maid opened the door, I stepped inside and met my student. Femme Bao stood in the living room with the posture of a spoiled prince and the expression of someone who had just stepped on a snake. "You," he choked out. "What are you doing here?" I set my bag down. "Working," I replied. "Your parents hired me." Bao spun toward the staircase, likely to protest. A woman's voice stopped him. "Bao, sit." His mother entered, elegant and cold, her eyes sharp enough to cut fabric. She studied me without disdain. "So you're the one," she said, "the Trin girl." I held her gaze. She nodded once. "Good. Teach him." Bao fought at first in the childish way rich boys fight. Threats, sarcasm, excuses about genius not needing school. I answered each with calm. Calm is a weapon. People who crave drama don't know how to defend against it. I reviewed his exam papers and discovered his math skills were a tragedy, but his essays were surprisingly strong. "You can think," I told him. "You just don't like effort," he scowled. "Effort is for losers." I leaned closer. "Then become a loser for a while," I said. "Losers improve." For the first time, Bao looked genuinely offended. Not by insult, but by the possibility that I might be right. Weeks turned into months. Bao's scores rose. His mother paid on time and increased my fee without negotiating. Bao complained less and began to ask questions without hiding them behind arrogance. One night, after a long session, he blurted, "Why are you doing this? You could just take the Trin money." I almost laughed. "Money without freedom is a leash," I answered. He stared at me as if I had spoken a foreign language. In a way, I had. By winter, my name climbed the school rankings. The gossip about my status faded behind the harder gossip about my grades. Teachers who once ignored me began to smile. Classmates who had avoided me began to ask for notes. I watched the shift with detached amusement. Humans were remarkably consistent across centuries. They worshipped whatever looked like strength. I did not resent them. I simply made sure my strength came from work, not from their approval. I began spending weekends away from the Trin mansion, not out of rebellion but out of hunger. The city had museums, libraries, metro lines, and parks where teenagers argued about music instead of ration cards. I walked through an exhibition on the old wars and stood in front of a glass case holding a cracked radio set. My breath fogged the glass. A docent explained its components to a group of students, calling the device primitive, with affectionate amusement. I wanted to correct him, to say that the machine had once been a lifeline, that we had pressed our ears against its static to locate hope. I stayed silent and listened as the students asked lazy questions, because their laziness was proof that the terror had ended. In the museum gift shop, a veteran in a faded cap noticed my stare. He asked, "You have family in the archives?" His voice was gentle, not intrusive. I answered honestly, "In a way." He nodded as if he understood that history held people in complicated ways. He told me he visited the museum when he felt angry at the present. "It helps," he said. "To remember the past was worse and still we got through." I thanked him, and when he walked away I realized my hands were shaking. The body I lived in had never held a rifle, never crawled through mud, and yet my soul remembered. That mismatch was exhausting. I started writing at night in a notebook I kept hidden in my dorm drawer. I wrote, "Dear Dao, I don't know where you went, but I'm sorry I'm wearing your life like a borrowed coat. I will try not to stain it with bitterness." In my new class, I gained a friend almost by accident. Her name was Ni, and she spoke like she was always chasing a train. She sat beside me during a physics lab and announced, "You look like you can survive anything, so I'm adopting you." Before I could protest, she introduced me to her study group. They did not care about my family scandal. They cared about whether I could explain electromagnetism without sighing. When I explained, they stared as if I had pulled a rabbit out of a hat. "No hat," I said. "Just desperation." Ni laughed and said, "Then we'll be desperate together." Friendship in this era was still built from the same materials as before. Shared effort, shared snacks, and the relief of being seen without being measured. One night, after studying until the dorm hallway lights switched to their energy-saving dim, I opened a notebook and wrote a letter to the girl whose body I had borrowed. I did not know where her consciousness had gone, if she had disappeared, if she had moved on, if she watched from somewhere like a silent roommate. Still, I wrote, because writing was how I made the world obey. I told her I was sorry for living in the rooms she had begged to enter. I told her I could feel her longing sometimes, like a bruise under my own skin. I promised I would not waste what she had been denied. I ended the letter with a line that felt both strange and true. If you are anywhere, I will carry us both towards something better. When I closed the notebook, my chest loosened slightly, as if a knot had been acknowledged. In the final semester, my father tried again to pull me into the orbit of his plans. He invited me to a small dinner, which was code for a gathering of families with equal wealth and strategic daughters. I declined. He demanded an explanation. I said, "I'm studying," he scoffed. "Studying won't matter if you don't know how to stand in society." Society, to him, meant ballroom smiles and marriage contracts. I answered with the blunt truth he had never expected from me. If my future depends on a husband, then my future is too small. Silence struck the dining room. Vi's lips tightened. Hui looked down at his plate, as if he wished to vanish. My father's face darkened. He dismissed me with a wave, like throwing away a receipt. The next day, he sent a message through Hi. "If you insist on living like this, don't come crying later." I did not cry. I worked. I joined a science competition team and slept in 90-minute fragments. I drank instant coffee that tasted like regret. I memorized formulas until my dreams were full of numbers. In my old life, numbers had meant survival. Here they meant opportunity. And opportunity was a kind of survival too. When the national exam arrived, my hands were steady. The classroom smelled of paper and anxiety. Students around me whispered prayers to gods they didn't believe in. I thought of the basement radio room. I thought of the thin boy I had loved, the one who had carried messages across streets under blackout and had promised me, foolishly, "If we live, we'll see peace." I wrote my answers as if I were writing to him. The results shook the city. I placed first in the province. Reporters called my school. Universities sent invitations. My father called me directly for the first time in months, his voice suddenly warm with pride he had not earned. "We will host a celebration," he announced. "You and Vi can be introduced properly." I pictured a banquet where strangers would congratulate me while silently measuring my value. I declined again. I told him I had already chosen my university. "Which one?" he demanded, assuming it would be one of the elite business schools that produced obedient executives. "The National Institute of Defense Science," I said. On the other end of the line, I heard the sharp inhale of a man who did not understand a daughter who could not be traded. "Are you insane?" he snapped. "That's not a place for a girl." I laughed softly. "In my first life, the battlefield didn't ask if I was a girl," I said. He did not understand the sentence, because he did not know it was literal. He only heard rebellion. My acceptance letter arrived with a stamp that looked almost ceremonial. Along with it came a notice. A background review would be conducted for close relatives. The Trin family, with its complex web of business ties, suddenly looked less like a blessing and more like a potential obstacle. When I returned home briefly to collect documents, my mother tried to persuade me with gentle fear. "It's dangerous," she said. "It's exhausting. Why choose hardship?" I answered quietly. "Because peace costs work." She stared at me as if I were a stranger, which I was. That summer, Hui invited me to his wedding. The invitation was polite, carefully timed, like a businessman offering a meeting slot. I went, not because I felt close to him, but because I wanted to witness how people built families in this era. The wedding hall was full of familiar faces. Classmates grown taller, adults grown heavier, smiles polished by years of pretending. People stared at me and whispered, noticing how my face resembled Hui's more than Vi's did. Old gossip rewrote itself in new directions. I ignored it. Pham Bao was there, wearing a suit that fit him like he had finally accepted his own body. When he saw me, his shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested relief. "Long time," he said, awkward. You look different." I shrugged. "So do you." His mother approached, elegant as always, and teased him loudly. "Bao, invite her to dinner. You owe her at least a lifetime." Bao nearly choked. I smiled and said, "Auntie, he's already busy being a better person." Bao's ears turned red. It was the first time I saw him embarrassed by something other than fear. In the hallway, I passed V and Kian. Their marriage had happened quickly after graduation, like a contract finalized to stop rumors from spreading. They were arguing, voices low but sharp. Kian hissed, "Do you know what they said at that table? They said you don't look like the Trins." They looked at me like I married the wrong woman. Vi snapped back, "You knew the truth for years. Are you ashamed because she's prettier now, or because she's real?" I walked past them without slowing. Their problems belonged to their choices. After the wedding, I returned to my institute and disappeared into laboratories and secure buildings where phones were restricted. My world became data sets, coded communications, and ethics briefings. It felt strangely familiar. The discipline, the secrecy, the weight of responsibility. I thrived. Years passed. The Trin family became a distant headline I no longer read. Life at the institute was harsher in the best possible way. Nobody cared about my surname. They cared about my endurance. We ran drills at dawn, then attended lectures on cryptography, network defense, and ethical command. In the evenings, we studied case files where a single weak password had damaged an entire system. I felt at home in the strictness. The rules were clear. The stakes were real. There was no stage makeup to hide bruises, and no gossip column to rewrite my effort into scandal. A colonel who taught information security noticed my obsession with old communication methods. He asked why I could dismantle a radio faster than most first years could open a laptop case. I hesitated, then said, "I like understanding how messages survive." He nodded and replied, "Good. In our work, messages are lives." He became a quiet mentor, never asking personal questions, only demanding competence. Under his guidance, I built tools that could detect intrusion patterns early, like a sentry listening for unfamiliar footsteps. When my code passed a rigorous review, the colonel simply said, "Acceptable," and I felt prouder than I had ever felt under applause. Pham Bao changed too, in his own uneven way. During my second year, he sent me a message. "I'm sorry I treated you like garbage. I didn't know how to be scared, so I was cruel." I stared at the screen for a long time, then replied with a single line, "Apologies matter only if they change your next choice." Months later, I heard he had joined a public administration track and volunteered at a tutoring program for kids who couldn't afford private lessons. I did not call that redemption. I called it direction. As for V, she remained a shadow at the edge of my story. She traveled abroad with Kian, posted glossy photos, and curated a life that looked perfect. Yet when she returned once for a holiday, she found me in the mansion hallway by accident. She studied my face and said softly, "You never hated me." It was not a question. "I didn't have time," I answered. Vi swallowed. "I did," she admitted, and the confession made her look younger than I had ever seen her. "I hated you for existing." I nodded, acknowledging the honesty without rewarding it. "And now?" I asked. She looked away. "Now I'm tired," she whispered. "I'm tired of being a performance." I could have comforted her. I could have become the saint in her personal story. Instead, I chose truth. "Then stop performing," I said. "If you want to be human, be human. That's not something I can do for you." She blinked rapidly as if holding back tears. "You're cruel," she said, almost gently. "I'm practical," I replied. "Cruel would be pretending you're fine." That was the closest we came to peace. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but the mutual recognition that neither of us could rewrite the past without breaking ourselves. Then, during my doctoral program, an article slipped through my filters and caught my eye. The Trin Corporation had won a bid to develop a parcel of land in an old district, an area scheduled for demolition and redevelopment. The project halted abruptly after a series of incidents. Workers reported shadows. Equipment failed. Accidents happened in patterns that made engineers uneasy. Photos leaked online. Security officers in tactical gear, and an elderly man in a dark robe holding a compass and a wooden talisman shaped like a gourd. In one photo, a small pendant hung from the old man's hand, half hidden by dust. My breath stopped. I recognized the gourd pendant, not from this life's memory, but from my death. I had carried one. I had given its twin to Trung Duk. My hand shook as I zoomed in. The pendant's red cord looked faded, like a vein drained of blood. I called Hui. His voice sounded exhausted, older than the day he sat by my hospital bed. "Don't come," he warned immediately. "The area is sealed. Officially, it's an investigation. Unofficially, it's bad." I heard fear behind his control, and it made my stomach tighten. I have to see it, I said. There's something there that belongs to me. Hui went silent. What do you mean? I did not explain. Some truths cannot be transmitted. They must be witnessed. 2 weeks before the national exam, my father attempted one last performance of authority. He held a formal dinner at the mansion and invited a family he called respected partners. The son, Kwang Li, arrived in a tailored suit and offered me a practiced smile. He spoke about business opportunities and overseas schools as if reading from a brochure. My mother hovered with anxious hope, watching for sparks that would justify her years of balancing guilt and pride. My father gestured toward Kwang and said, "You two should talk more. You're both ambitious." I set down my chopsticks. Ambition isn't rare, I said calmly. Integrity is rarer. The room chilled. My father's eyes narrowed. Watch your tone, he warned. I looked at Kwang, then back at my father. If you want me to marry, I said, then any immediate relatives in 3 generations will undergo security review. That is standard for my chosen path. Are you comfortable with investigators examining every contract you've signed? Every foreign tie you've maintained? Every favor you've traded at banquets like this? The question landed with the weight of a stamp. Kwang's smile froze. My father's face drained of its easy arrogance. For the first time, he was forced to imagine a world where his money could not buy his way past scrutiny. My mother inhaled sharply, then covered it with a nervous laugh. Dao is joking, she tried. I'm not, I said gently, and my gentleness made it worse. I'm simply telling you the cost of trying to own my future. After that dinner, my father stopped inviting me to play the obedient daughter. He did not apologize, but he also did not interfere with my application paperwork again. Sometimes a tyrant retreats not because he has learned kindness, but because he has met a boundary he cannot afford to cross. The next morning, I arrived at the sealed site with 2 security escorts assigned by my institute, men who wore civilian clothes but moved like soldiers. Hui waited at the barricade, face pale, eyes hollow. Dao, he said, using the name that had never felt fully mine. This isn't a place for you. I looked past him at the skeletal remains of an old apartment building, its windows broken like missing teeth. The air was colder than the season. The hair on my arms rose. Somewhere inside, something was waiting. A team in tactical uniform stopped us, hands near weapons. Their leader demanded credentials. My escort produced papers with stamps that made people stop arguing. The elderly man in the robe turned, his eyes unexpectedly gentle. When his gaze met mine, he exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath for decades. So, he murmured, the thread returns. His accent was old-fashioned, his words heavy with meanings I didn't yet have. He waved the security team back. Let her pass, he said. She is the one the vow called. We entered the building. Dust hung in the light like suspended time. Each step up the wooden stairs produced a groan that sounded almost like speech. Hui hovered behind me, reluctant yet unable to stop. On the 2nd floor, a door stood half open. The room beyond it was darker than it should have been, as if daylight refused to enter. The old man held up a talisman and whispered under his breath. My escort stayed at the threshold, tense. I walked inside alone. The room smelled of damp wood and faint ink. In the corner sat an old desk coated in dust, and on the wall above it hung the gourd pendant, swaying slightly though there was no wind. My throat tightened. I stepped closer. The cord looked brittle. On the desk lay a notebook, pages curled, writing faded but still legible in places, 3 characters written in a steady hand. Lin An, not Dao, not Qin Dao. Lin An had been my name before I became a ghost in history. My hands trembled as I reached for the pendant. The cord snapped with a soft sound, and the gourd dropped into my palm. The wood was worn smooth by fingers that were not mine. On the back, scratched faintly, were 2 words. Wait, always. The air shifted. The shadows in the room gathered as if drawn by a magnet. A temperature drop pressed against my skin. I turned slowly. In the darkest part of the room, a figure stood. Tall, thin, dressed in the simple white shirt of another century. His face familiar in the way grief makes familiarity permanent. His eyes were the same eyes I had seen in my dying moment. Trung Duk, I whispered, and the name left my mouth like a prayer. He did not move at first. Then he took 1 step forward, and the light caught a scar along his neck, an old wound that looked both healed and eternal. I raised my hand to touch him. My fingers met nothing. He raised his hand too, then stopped inches from my cheek, as if held back by an invisible wall. The cruelty of the distance struck me harder than any war. Tears spilled. "How long?" I asked, voice breaking. "How long have you been here?" His mouth opened. His voice emerged like a memory dragged through water. "Long enough to forget the days," he said. "Short enough to remember your name." I swallowed. "Why didn't you leave?" His eyes softened, unbearably gentle. "Because I promised," he replied. "I said I would see peace with you. I couldn't find you, so I waited where the vow was anchored." A laugh escaped me, ragged and bitter. "I died," I said. "I died and woke up in a world we dreamed of, and you stayed behind in rot and dust." He looked down, shame flickering across his face. "I didn't choose it," he whispered. I held on too tightly. The last thing I wanted was one more meeting. Wanting became a chain. Behind me, the old man entered, careful not to step between us. "His merit is strong," he said quietly. "He did good deeds in life, but his attachment is deeper." The building became a knot. When the Trin project disturbed the ground, the knot tightened and began to lash out. Machines broke, people fell. Not because he wanted harm, but because his pain leaked. Hui's voice came from the doorway, shaking. "Dao, what is this?" I turned my head slightly and answered without looking at him. "My past," I said, "not yours." He went silent, perhaps finally understanding that he had never known me at all. I faced Trungduk again. "Do you remember how you used to scold me?" I asked, trying to steady my voice. "You told me I was reckless, that I treated my own life like it was expendable." He smiled faintly. "You were," he admitted. "You still are." I held the gourd pendant between my palms. In the old folk belief, a gourd could hold medicine, poison, spirits, luck. I had once bought these pendants at a roadside stall, thinking they were only decoration. "I gave you this because I thought it would keep you safe," I said. "Instead, it kept you trapped." Trungduk shook his head. "It didn't trap me," he said. "I trapped myself. The pendant is just where I chose to stand." He paused, then added softly, "Seeing you now is enough." "No," I said, because my heart, even with 2 lifetimes of discipline, still had the stubbornness of a girl who had refused to surrender. "It's not enough. You deserve to leave." The old man nodded, as if he had been waiting for that sentence. "Then you must release the vow," he said. "Not with anger, but with gratitude. Speak to him as the living speak to the dead, with truth that does not demand." I inhaled. I looked into Trungduk's eyes. "We did not live long," I said. "But you were my home in a time that had no homes. You carried messages. You shared your bread. You lied to me about being unafraid so I could be brave. I have lived to see peace, and it is beautiful. It is messy, and people still hurt each other for stupid reasons, but children sleep without listening for planes. That is the peace you wanted." My voice cracked. "You don't have to hold it anymore. You don't have to wait for me." Tears blurred my vision. I continued anyway. "Thank you for loving me in a world designed to erase us. Thank you for letting me go even when you couldn't. If you need permission, I give it now. Go." Trungduk's expression changed, a slow uncoiling. The tension in the air loosened. His shoulders dropped as if he had been carrying stone. "Linhan," he whispered, using my old name with perfect care. "You grew up." I laughed through tears. "In the strangest way," I answered. He stepped back, and for the first time, the room's darkness lightened. Sunlight slid across the dusty desk. The old man raised his talisman and murmured words that sounded like both prayer and mathematics. Trungduk's outline began to fade, not violently, but like mist in morning. He lifted his hand one last time, and though he still could not touch me, the gesture felt like a touch anyway. "Live well," he said. "That was always my wish. I will," I promised. And the promise did not feel like a chain. It felt like a door. When he vanished, the room fell silent. The air warmed. Outside, a bird called, ordinary and free. I looked down at the pendant in my palm. The wood felt lighter, as if something inside had finally emptied. Hui stepped into the room, face pale. "Dao," he said again, carefully. "Who are you?" I considered the question. I could have lied. I had lied often in my first life to keep others alive. But now, In this era that had been built by truth hammered into policy and law, I was tired of masks. I am Qin Dao, I said slowly. And I am also someone who died before this era existed. I met his eyes. Either way, I am not your bargaining chip. Hui swallowed. He looked around the room, at the desk, at the dust, at the empty space where a ghost had stood. His pride cracked slightly. I'm sorry, he whispered. I did not know if he meant for his years of neglect or for his inability to understand, but I nodded anyway. Do better, I said. Not for me, for whoever you claim to love. Outside, the old man spoke to the security team. The site would be cleared, properly, with respect and procedures that recognized both physical risk and human superstition. The Trin project would restart eventually, but not with the arrogance of people who believed money could erase history. On the drive back to my institute, I held the gourd pendant and watched the city lights blur past. I felt grief, yes, but it was no longer an open wound. It was a scar that proved something had healed. That night, I returned to my lab and opened my laptop. I had work to do, models to refine, systems to secure, young students to teach. Peace, I had learned, was not a gift that arrived complete. Peace was built, day by day, by people who chose responsibility over comfort. In my first life, I had fought for the possibility of such days. In this second life, I would not waste them.